Hello dear learners, let me continue the discussion on the various aspects related to needs, values, incentives. In the previous session, I have given you the very basic meaning of these terms, and I have talked about the needs and different the insights from the research with respect to the need patterns among the public sector employees, depending upon the kind of levels they are working on and depending upon the kind of salaries they were getting, right? So let me continue and move to the next important the aspect related to the performance behavior and the motivation among people is about values, right? So values, they say they are very basic components of motivation because they guide people's behavior. They will give the indication to the people what is right, what is wrong, how they should plan their work, which comes across to be or the work which is a good work, right? And especially in the case of public sector organization, it has much more importance, right? So as I have told you in the previous session also, Rockich in this particular area is the authority. I have given the reference of the the title also here, Rockich Value Survey, the nature of human values. Those of you are interested, and you will find this particular the resource available in all the major organizational psychology and behavior textbook. Your textbook also on by Rene Fernandez and Malatesta talks about this. We'll just briefly review what the meaning of terminal values and what are the research insights on the values with respect to public sector employees, right? Now, as I have already told you that when we talk about values, we look at the end state of existence and of course the specific mode of conduct or means to reach those particular states, right? So according to Rockich, the end state of existence, what people are looking forward to in terms of achieve in their life, they are termed as terminal values, right? And what are the ways, what are the specific mode of conduct or the means, if we say that, to reach those values are considered to be the instrumental values as they talked about, right? Now, given example, some of the example that are mentioned in there in the text are from Rockich. End state of existence, people might be looking for, let's say, a comfortable life. Some of the examples I am writing here, right? Somebody is looking for end state of existence to be happy. Happiness is another end state of existence. Or specific mode of conduct, what are the means that you are going to be using in terms of reaching that. You can be helpful in terms of your behavior, means, what kind of means that you want to be using. You want to come across as a person who is polite person, and the same is also being used when you are your specific mode of conduct. And also you see that these are socially preferable the values, and then it guides your behavior to reach to the end states of existence, right? So this is about the meaning of the terminal and instrumental values. Let's look into the example of what are the highly preferred and the least preferred terminal values and instrumental values among the public sector employees, right? Here I would like to mention the reference number 3 here by Connor and Becker, personal value systems and decision making styles of public managers. They actually found the similar results with respect to what is mentioned in the reference number 4 study by Sikula. So according to Connor and Becker, the highly preferred terminal values among the public sector employees in terms of the end state of existence, some of the examples I am writing, they are looking for family security. That is what their paper mentioned, that they are the highly preferred the terminal values, or they also self respect. And the authors also mentioned that they are largely in I would say in line with what the other research also talked about, the terminal values and instrumental values among the public sector employees, right? Also accomplishment, somebody is achieving sense of accomplishment in their end state of existence as terminal values. And highly preferred instrumental values among public sector employees found to be means of conduct, being honest, right? Also being helpful, and of course being responsible. And also if you look at being responsible is very important value in terms of your conduct in the public sector organization. And also if you can recall in the very first module when we talked about the framework of public management given by Lynn, we have talked about public management as a responsible practice. So when you are a public official, you are holding your office, you have great responsibility on your shoulder, so you have to conduct in a very responsible way. So what is the responsible practice? We have looked into this in very much detail when we talked about Lynn's framework. For example, you have to be accountable, right? You should be rational, logical in your approach when you do the work for people, right? So the actions that you are taking, the decisions you are taking should not be erratic, should be well thought of, responsible decision making. So these are the aspects which are very, very important in the context of the public sector organization. So if you look at the least preferred the values according to the research, as I mentioned, so least preferred terminal values are pleasure amongst the pleasure as an end state of existence, or I would say a comfortable life. And the instrumental values, means of conduct, they will say that cheerful or polite. These are some of the values they have listed about in terms of what research says has been found amongst the people who are working in the public sector. And of course, these value system also will then lead to what kind of styles, decision making styles are being followed by the people, right? Because we are not talking about the decision making here. So if you are more interested in finding out the other decision making styles, please refer to the paper of Connor and Becker here to learn more about it in terms of the understanding, right? So this is what about we're talking about the concepts of the values here, right? Okay, moving on. We are going to talk about the concept of incentives. And incentives, as I have already told you about, what are the incentives? Incentives are the things which are there in the external environment, which excites people to put in more and more efforts to get access to those resources from their environment, right? So this is another important interesting area. I will say the important variable where the organizations they work on, right? So these are incentives, and incentives can be both types, incentives in terms of money or incentives in terms of appreciation. So we'll talk about in terms of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards in that particular context, right? So another important thing that I want to mention to all of you is if you can recall when we discussed about the school of the management thoughts in the module number 2, we also talked about the Chester Bernard's economy of incentives, the concept, where we talked about that when you really want people to work in the organization, right? So their contribution and the efforts by the individuals, they actually you have to pay them, you return this particular their service by the incentives. There are inducements, they say that the word used is inducements given by the organization. So contributions and efforts by individuals in return of incentives given by organization, right? So this is again also very true in terms of all the context of organizations, being it public and private. People work because they expect organizations to return the efforts that they are putting in terms of the incentives, could be intrinsic or extrinsic, right? Now in that context, what Bernard also mentioned it that of course design of incentives is one thing, that you have to create incentives in such a way that it excites people to work more, right? And also if the effort they are putting in and the incentive they are getting in hand, if they are not in equilibrium, if they are not incentives, those are considered to be valuable incentives, then the contributions and the efforts made by people would not be great, right? So I'm not saying always money. I'm talking about in terms of the incentives that are valued by the people. So money may not be always a motivator to for people to do that, but certain inducement, the combination of inducement that the organization is providing people, that's what really matters, right? Now once the incentives are designed or inducements are designed, the duty of the public managers and the, of course we can say, leaders is to look for the resources to provide those incentives, right? So you also should have resources to provide those incentives. I'll just quickly review what we have discussed in the categorization of incentives as mentioned in the work of Bernard in the functions of executive. Bernard talked about two broad categories of the incentives: specific incentives and the general incentives. So in terms of specific incentive, they are saying that these are the, as the name indicates, these are the specific incentives. Specific means incentives that are given to the individuals in the organization, right? For example, there could be examples of material related inducements, which includes something which can be equated with the money, right? Money, the things that are important for people, so you design in that, or also could be some kind of personal non-materialistic inducements, right? Your text also mentioned about this, but I'm referring to the work of Bernard here. You can also find very interesting the insights much more on the functioning of public organizations, bureaucracy and things like that. So in terms of the personal non-materialistic, is something which is not equated with money. It's just to do with much more recognition, much more prestige, right? Distinction or things like that. And in terms of general incentives which are available for people across, these are the incentives which are available for more and more number of people there, right? So that's what is the categorization of incentive. So for example, in terms of general incentive, if you look at, there can be associational attractiveness to work with an organization. Also the working condition, what you are getting from the organizations, and also personal comfort that you enjoy because of your association with that particular organization, a thing which is called as condition of communion, right? So these are the incentives which are considered important in terms of, and of course in addition to this there are many other incentives also which are being listed, are mentioned in the text, but I'm only talking about this because I'm more interested in discussing about the research studies which try to give the insights on what are the kind of incentives which are more prevalent in the context of the public sector organizations, right? So let us look into some of the the research studies published, and they talked about the aspects of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards in that say, right? So if you look at the study by Bulens and Van Broek in 2007, they talked about that public sector employees, they gave less importance to pay, which is an extrinsic monetary reward. So public sector employees, they gave less importance to pay, which is an extrinsic motivation monetary reward in comparison to their private sector counterparts. So they have done some analysis of the work motivation between public and private sector organization published in Public Administration Review. So they talked about that public sector employees are found to be less motivated by the extrinsic monetary rewards, and in comparison to their private counterparts. On the other hand, the study by Park and Ward, they talked about that both public sector as well as non-profit sector employees, they are much more motivated by the intrinsic factors, right? They are motivated by intrinsic factors much more. What are the factors that they consider more important for the public and non-profit employees? It is to do with the organizational reputation, and of course the public service, their ability to serve the public. That is what they have talked about in terms of the motivation with respect to intrinsic factors among public and non-profit employees, right? Now the other this study talked about the intrinsic rewards, which has higher motivation for public managers. What kind of intrinsic reward they talk about? Work which is beneficial for the society, right? This is the kind of intrinsic rewards. It says that work which is beneficial for the society. Also, if one receive recognition of the work that they are doing for the benefit of the society. Also, these people derive much more motivation from helping others, and they have, of course, high achievement orientation. So these intrinsic rewards are broadly categorized into these important intrinsic reward, and they say that these are the high motivation potential. These intrinsic rewards are higher motivational potential for public managers, right? Then there is a Indian study which is mentioned at the reference number 5 here by Satyavadi and Ghosh, published in the International Journal of Human Resources Development and Management. The paper titled Motivation and Work Values in Indian Public and Private Sector Enterprises. According to these authors, they have also found a similar pattern in terms of intrinsic factors being higher, having higher motivation potential among the Indian public sector employees. Let us look into what kind of intrinsic factor they have studied. So, according to authors Satyavadi and Ghosh, they talked about that intrinsic factors including achievement, self-control, achievement and self-control, taking pride in one's work. Somebody is, very much, inclined towards their work, and they are taking such satisfaction and pride in their work, right? And of course, one's involvement in one's job, also growth in one's career in the public sector, and also your preference for the work activities. What kind of preference you are having for the work activities, which keeps you very busy in your work because you are really engrossed in their work, you value your work, and when you do your work, it really gives you a lot of motivation. So these are some of the factors which has been found to be motivating the Indian public sector employees, having higher motivation potential by intrinsic factors, right? There is another study which talked about the health sector in particular among Indian public sector employees. They say that intrinsic factors were found to have higher motivation potential. So we see a similar kind of pattern here, but there are also other studies which do not find who have reported the kind of mixed findings, right? So concluding remarks, I would say, in this public and private sector comparison, of course, I have included studies which have talked about this, but there could also be exceptions in some of the cases, and these exceptions, these mixed findings of whether intrinsic rewards are important or extrinsic rewards are important, they can vary, right? And that variation is due to people working at different levels in the organization, their demographic, such as age, are ages, if you look at the age, they also impact what they will prefer more in terms of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. So what I'm trying to say, broad generalization would be difficult, because there are many other factors also which can impact the way the public sector employees think about these reward systems. There could also be aspect related to the culture, which can possibly impact these have something on the findings. Occupational context, individual values and preferences could be different. Because of that, you will see also a different kind of mixed finding from the literature also. But largely, if you see that, this has been found that intrinsic factors have a greater motivation potential for public sector employees. One of the another reason which I find is to be interesting is that why intrinsic factor holds very true in terms of having higher motivation potential among the public sector employees is to do with the long-term sustaining impact of these rewards, rather than the extrinsic reward, which will largely have the short-term impact. So I will also like to recall, the discussion that I have made when I discussed about the theory, Herzberg's two-factor theory, where we talked about the hygiene factors and the motivators factors. So there, when we discussed about this particular aspect, I discussed that the hygiene factors, the external factors in the environment, which is a source of kind of dissatisfaction for employees, no matter what organization does with those factors, they tend to lead to the source of dissatisfaction. Maybe they'll give some kind of no dissatisfaction stage to people for some time, which is a short term aspect of it, but for longer term impact of the incentives, the motivators have the higher potential, and especially in case of the public sector organization, right? The motivators have to be thought about by the organizational managers, how the organization will design the work environments and the jobs that continue to excite employees to sustain their efforts in terms of working hard in terms of enhancing their performance, right? So there could be another, this is another explanation that I could thought of in terms of why intrinsic factors, are found to be important amongst the public sector employees with respect to having higher motivational potential. But nevertheless, there are research studies who also talked about the mixed finding. Some studies they have found differences, others they did not find many differences, and various factors that they have talked about we have just discussed in terms of different levels, age-wise differences, cultural context, and so on and so forth, right? So this is about the aspect of the incentives in the organizational context, right? Let us continue and see the aspect of motives, right? Motives are another important context that we need to discuss in relation to what we say as factors which can impact employees to work in the required or desired direction, right? Now, as we have talked about motives in terms of the, I would say, the force within the individuals, which is kind of pushing or influencing them to work into the desired, direction to achieve the motives that they have to, fulfill and acquire from the outside environment, right? So here I would like to talk about the motives in the context of public organization, and I am referring to the work of Anthony Downs, a theory of bureaucracy. So according to Downs, in terms of motives, public officials, or we'll say administrators, according to Downs, they have a complex set of goals that includes various elements, right? So officials, they focus on a complex set of goals with various elements. Let's look at what kind of elements they talk about. See, in terms of the public sector employees, officials who are working in the public sector organization on the bureaucracy, as Downs mentioned, some of the elements of these goals are related to somebody's desire to contribute to public interest, desire to contribute to public interest. Okay. Also, another element of the goal is to gain prestige, or let's say power, or also could be income. These are the important elements of the goals that the public official look forward to achieve, right? Also can be looking for security or convenience, taking pride in the work well done. These are all the elements which are mentioned by Downs in terms of the goals that the public sector officials or the administrator they like to fulfill in terms of acquisition, right? Also could be loyalty towards some policy, or I would say some institution. These are some of the things that they are important complex goals, set of goals with the various elements as they have listed. Now, according to Downs, all these elements and the officials' different preferences, these are the category of the elements in set of the goals that they are looking forward to achieve. Now, doesn't mean that all the people will look for all the kind of things, right? Depending upon their individual preferences, depending upon I would say the elements, the attraction towards these elements, and of course the individual preferences. Downs actually categorized or classified official into two broad categories, right? And one of the categories defined by Downs is the category of the administrators, of the officials who are driven by self-interest, and we will look into the category what all these terms, climbers, conservers, all these terms are coined by downs in the paper. So two categories of people: officials who are driven by the self-interest, and we look at on what basis of these elements these people they are giving preferences to. Also another category is officials who are driven by the mixed motives, right? For example, zealots, advocates and statesmen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about these officials in terms of what they would look forward to in terms of these goals, what are their inclinations, right, with respect to their individual preferences, and then we will further build on the aspect of public service motivation in that way, right? Let's first of all look into the aspects of the first category of the officials here, officials who are driven by self-interest. So these people, they derive motivation. We'll see that they derive motivation for fulfillment of the self-interest because of the goals which are mentioned here. So we look into this, right? Now these people, they always give importance to the goals which provide much more benefits to them, right? More rather than the organization or the society for which they are working, right? So these are the people who are actually giving much more importance to the self-interest, much more importance to the kind of goals mentioned here, which is benefiting them rather than their organization and society, right? So the first category of these officials, as Downs mentioned, are the climbers. Now who are the climbers? They are the people who wanted to maximize power and the prestige, and hence the income also. Maximizing power and the prestige is the motive that these people wanted to fulfill. That is what is influencing them, pushing them, a force inside which is putting them to get into the efforts to achieve that particular thing, right? But how they would achieve, right? So prestige, power and income, how they would achieve, what are the means to gain prestige or power? One of the ways is mentioned is, if you're really looking for prestige and power, you also have to gain access to the top level in the hierarchy, in terms of, I'm talking about getting promotions in the organizations, or if that opportunity is not available within the organization, these people will look forward for these the opportunities elsewhere in other organizations, which can actually increase their I would say power, prestige or income, right? So these climbers, their motives are clear. They are driven by self-interest. So their motivation is more to do with gaining prestige, gaining power and income by the way of reaching to the top positions in the organization, because reaching at the top position will give them much more access to resources, give them much more prestige and of course much more power. Power to of course control resources, right? So that's the category of climbers there. Then there are conservers. Conservers also are the driven, these people, as the name indicates, conservers, right? They are more looking for the security, focus on increasing or maximizing the security, and of course these people look for the convenience. So you remember that we talked about these goals, the complex set of goals. So that's what the official driven by self-interest, some of the goals will be important for these category of the officials, right? So these people, conservers, they look for security and they look for the convenience, right? So how they will achieve this, what are the means that they will follow to achieve this thing? For example, when we talked about climbers look for the opportunities within the organization and outside the organization to gain resources, more prestige and power and income. But for these people who are conservers, what they do in terms of their means to look for security and convenience is to maintain their positions. They want to maintain their position, and they try to focus on maintaining the level of things that they were doing. These people are not motivated to do any kind of changes, because if the changes are to be introduced or changes are put in place, there will be a challenge to the status quo and they are feeling comfortable with, right? So these are the characteristics of the climbers and the conservers, who are officials which are who are driven by the self-interest. I will again pick up this discussion when we will discuss about the Downs organizational life cycle model in the administrative reform module in our discussions in times to come, right? So I will close here. I will continue this discussion on motives and officials driven by mixed motive in the next class, and then we will talk about the public service motivation in much more detail.